back to Pints and Podcasts here at RavenTek Studios. My name is Maria Pineda, and today we'll be talking about the state of sUAS training or small unmanned autonomous systems, how it compares to crewed aircraft training, and why how we train today may not be adequate for the missions of tomorrow. Joining us are Kevin Forrest, former Air Force flight instructor, now overseeing the tactical business unit here at RavenTek, and Saif Butt, leading inside sales efforts within the DoD. Welcome, gents.
Thank you.
Morning.
Yes, good morning. So, side note, this is called Pines and Podcasts, but since it's 9 a.m. here, we are drinking. I'm drinking coffee. What are you guys drinking?
I
Monk
definitely,
fruit sweetened Red Bull.
I,
Beautiful.
I definitely have some coffee and some water for sure.
Okay. Okay. Well, the beer is for 5 p.m. So, um, let's kick things off with an icebreaker. That was not the icebreaker. If you could simulate anything prior to doing it in real life, what would it be and why?
Let's go first.
I think that's an interesting question. I think if it was me, I would love to simulate a financial management plan
Huh?
for myself to be able to go, okay, if I do this with my money, this is how the outcome will be. Obviously, that would be a wildly large database and pretty predictive. If you could put that together, you'd probably make a whole lot of money if you could predict the future of the financial markets. But I think that would be something that would be interesting to me in my personal life.
Hmm.
Yeah, I don't think Kevin you should have any problem with money, but just kidding. For me, specifically, first thing that came to my mind was having kids. Like if I could simulate what it meant to raise a child, but also deal with my wife post pregnancy, that would have been great. Because I don't think there's probably been plenty of books written, but I think everybody's experience is unique because you have two different people coming together and having a child. So for me at least, that would have been amazing. I feel like I would have been less of a headache for my wife, but yeah, 100%.
That's
How
thoughtful.
to be a good dad in the first 6 months of a baby's life, for
Hmm.
sure.
Well, those would both be really great app ideas.
What about you?
That's a great question. I thought about this question, but I never really thought about my answer. Probably how this podcast is gonna go because this is my first time hosting. Um, but I appreciate the answers. Let's dive in though. Kevin, what would you say is the state of sUAS training as of today?
So it probably helps for me to give my background so people know who I am. So I spent 20 years in Air Force Special Operations Command. I flew on both the MH-53M Pavlo and the CV-22B Osprey. Ironically, both NavAir Marine Corps driven platforms that were being fielded in AFSOC. And in those platforms, I was a air education training command master instructor. I worked at our formal training unit and have instructed thousands of hours, thousands of flight hours of instruction, teaching young flight engineers how to operate those aircraft. So I think the state of sUAS training, from my point of view, is it's a pickup game. I like to compare it to when computers started coming out in the DoD. So when I joined the Air Force in 1997, there were very few computers. A lot of things were still done by hand and paper and logs, and units, organizations um, were just willy nilly buying different IT, right? So there was no standardization. There weren't even really networks for a little while, and then they started to build those, and then eventually the Air Force goes, whoa, we have all these disparate systems. We have people doing things their own way. There's no standardization. We're using commercial off the shelf products that aren't really meant for what we're doing, but they're getting the job done, but it's putting us at risk in in various ways. So I would say small UAS training or UAS training period, when we're talking about group 1 through 3 or the smaller UAS is in that same boat, right? We see people using Steam games, Liftoff. We see people using various different platforms. It could be Microsoft Flight Simulator or just anything they can get their hands on. Some of the OEMs that produce UAS have their own simulators. And, so there's real no standardization or capability that
Mhm.
can train all the platforms and give the DoD organization that is trying to produce combat capability rapidly the ability to do that in a sense that makes sense, right? Because one of the things is you move around in the military, and it's every organization's a little bit different when you move to it. But what you don't want is that training platform to be so different than when you move to it, you're starting over, or you're creating significantly different training standards across the force, because then you're not as interoperable, not only within your own service, but when you go out to provide forces to the combatant commanders. Nobody fights alone. It's not the Air Force. It's not the Navy. It's not the Space Force. It's not the Coast Guard. It's not the Marine Corps. Everybody, it's a purple fight. It's a joint fight. And if you're not coming to that joint fight with at least roughly the same skills and understanding, it's going to be difficult to integrate all those different services to put combat capability at the COCOM commander's hands.
I have a question or something to add. When you're talking about all this interoperability within different branches of the DoD, I think the easy answer for somebody like me who's just getting started into the DoD is that uh, there's a lot of politics involved in bureaucracy when it comes to tooling and relationships, and can go totally different podcasts on that note. But as far as it relates to that interoperability piece and sUAS training, you would think that would be something the DoD would have standardized on maybe a while ago. Is that the case, or is that not the case, or is it just like depends on who you're talking to within the DoD?
So I think you have to look at the acquisition process in the DoD. Standardization doesn't come from the unit level. Typically, it comes from the program office or the PEO, SPO, whatever you want to call it, or what it's. Those are the real names. They just vary in different places. But to get a program of record started that's going to then be pushed down to all of the services or all of the organizations under that service, it takes a little while. And what we're seeing, we see all the stuff coming out of the Pentagon, particularly what Secretary Hegseth and his new memos have put out, and they are just smashing the table and going drone on, and trying to build that capability fast to keep up with the enemy. And so when you look at the different colors of money and the different things where you go through that acquisition process, and you mentioned the politics and the bureaucracy. The bureaucracy is what I'm talking about. Is it takes a while for a program of record to build out that program, to adjust things, to compete things, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But then, so what happens is the organizations that have money inside their operations and maintenance budget, they'll use that to create a capability. And it kind of goes back to what I was talking about, the state of IT in the late 1990s, was that, it was like, okay, we need to get the job done. We have a mandate to do that job. We're going to go ahead and get the job done, especially when you start pushing acquisition authority down to the O6 level, or Navy captain, Air
Right.
Force, Army, Marine colonel level. That tends to drive a capability because it's like, I need it. I have to supply this. I'm deploying. I need this capability. We're just going to make it happen. And sometimes, that tends to not allow that. I think one of the biggest misnomers in the military is we have all the answers and everything's standardized, and before it gets pushed out, it's all said, right? It's all set. It's not like that, especially when you have rapidly emerging capabilities like we're seeing from the Ukrainian conflict and elsewhere.
On that note, bring brought something up to me that I actually listened to yesterday during a Navy Day at Caresoft. And they're saying that with the new administration, there's been within requirements that are being written, it's purposely kept in broad strokes so that way industry as well as the government can kind of creatively create processes and requirements that meet the need of the soldier at the end of the day, right? The warfighter. So is you've been in the military for quite some time and also working within the sector doing your thing. Have you seen like a tangible or felt a tangible change with the administration or even the last administration as far as meeting the capabilities and the needs of the warfighter are concerned?
Ooh, that's a good one. So I have high hopes, is what I'll say. And obviously, I'm well removed. I've been retired for 8 years, but still talk with a lot of people that aren't. Um, I think when you say creatively create processes, what that also equates to is running with scissors. So people are going to go run with scissors right now, and it's mandated running with scissors, right? Hurry up and build the capability. We'll figure the rest out later. I often say times you got to build a parachute on the way down, and I think that's what we're seeing in the sUAS space as we have different organizations like the Defense Innovation Unit and their Blue List, and then that's moving over to the Defense Contract Management Agency or DCMA.
Mhm.
And instead of a yearly ad or a biannual ad to the Blue List, now they're doing continuous ads to the Blue List. So I think we are seeing that start to shift, but again, it's not stopping organizations that are having to go, again, meet the COCOM's requirements to do different things. So they will do something that is, as close as it can be to be in bounds and get it across the line, and then they will figure out the standardization later. So I think you're going to see both. I think you'll see the program offices start to move really quickly for a program office, and I think you'll see the organizations taking that, O6 authority that has been granted to them to do stuff, and they'll run with scissors for a little bit, and then we'll definitely, and in any case like this, obviously there'll be some slack in the system or some waste in the system, in the sense that we'll do some things to get an initial capability, and then that initial capability will be sunset in favor of a program of record.
Hmm. Well, let's shift gears a little bit. Um, how would you say unmanned training compares to crew training?
So it's different but the same. A lot of the same principles apply, right? I think the number one thing that people don't think about in aircrew training, it's flying aircraft. It's an unforgiving space, even more so than being out on the water, right? So if you have a fire in flight, if you have an emergency procedure, if you have a fire in a boat, if you have an emergency procedure on the boat, you should continue to be able to float. If you're driving a car, you can pull over, so the risk is significantly lower. But the air is an unforgiving space, and whether that's manned or unmanned, you can still tear things up. You have to worry about when you're flying in an operation. You have to worry about your own forces. You have to worry about coordinating things and all the different stuff. But what I think is interesting is operating the platforms is often not the long pole in the tent, right? Doing the actual physical manipulation, whether that's on a controller or whether that's sitting in a set of controls inside of an aircraft, is arguably not so difficult for the average human, right? Most people can go to their local airport and they can take flying lessons in a Cessna, and they can be taught how to fly relatively quickly. Um, but I think that is much the same, especially with the modern UAS, with all the stabilization systems and their ability to do things, and that's part of the autonomous piece of that. It's not hard to operate that, but what you really have to, and here comes the other same part, right? So the different part is there are not humans in the platforms that's lives are at risk. In this case, it is the humans and the equipment on the ground that have risk. So when you're flying an aircraft, a large manned aircraft, and you have an emergency procedure, and you have to land, you have to find a place to land, and God willing, it's not going into somebody's house or whatever. Um, in this case, you're trying to save your own life, but having to worry about the other people's lives. In the UAS space, you still have to worry about the other people's lives that are below you, and as you move. So that's, a little bit different, but a little bit the same. I think the one thing that is very much the same is mission management. In the Air Force, at least, we call it helmet fire. And when you are flying, and then all of a sudden, all these mission management tasks come in, which is air traffic control, um, coordination with ground forces, coordination with command and control on the mission side, being able to relay messages, dealing with the unknown. The enemy always has a vote, the weather has a vote. All of that stuff starts bombarding the operator or the pilot of the UAS. And whether you're inside the aircraft or outside the aircraft, you are going to get that helmet fire. When we call it helmet fire is when it's called task saturation, right? So as these mission management tasks pile on, and in flight training, we purposely oversaturate the students, right? We push them to a point where they do get a helmet fire, and that provides stress inoculation. So you need to be able to do the same thing with small UAS. It's not enough to go, I can take off, go to a point, get into an orbit, perform an ISR mission, or I can take off, fly to a target, and crash into it for a one-way attack mission. Whatever happens to be the flavor of the mission of the day, it's coordinating the battle space and the airspace and everything else that's going on to do that. That's so important. So having that's the same. And you may even argue that it's more difficult for sUAS because you're not sitting in the aircraft. So now you are trying to maintain spatial awareness and situational awareness of a platform you're not even in. So you're using different tools like the tactical assault kit or the tactical awareness kit, or using some other flavor of common operating picture or common intelligence picture to manage where that UAS is in the battle space, when typically a manned system, they are in the aircraft. They know exactly where they're at in the battle space based on the systems that are in there, and they have physical spatial awareness of the aircraft. So again, same but different. But in this, at the end of the day, when it really comes down to it, to be a professional operator that is able to go out and prosecute a mission or an operational task, you need to be able to train to those mission goals or those operational goals, because nobody rises to the level of their capability, right? We see it in the movies all the time. Some guy shows up, he's never done anything, and magically he turns into a hero and wins the day, even though he had no idea what he was doing. That doesn't happen in real life. Most people fall to the level of their training. So, wherever you can get the level of their training to when that stress hits, that's really what their true capability is. And so what we have to do is raise the level of that training and provide that stress inoculation through being able to train those mission tasks before they're put in a real operational situation.
Have you guys like benchmarked your training against the training that, let's just say, um uh operators that are in school or still, like, going through college? Have you kind of benchmarked to see, like, if that, not only the stress levels, but the impact that their commanding officers want them to experience? Are you hearing it from, like, the horse's mouth, essentially, in terms of, like, yeah, this is really working for us. It's different. It's real world, or is it, this is more like something that we're evaluating, and we'll give you an answer in, like, 2 years, right? So,
Right. Well, and I think there's just not enough data. There's definitely data. I saw anecdotal data
right.
when people use our simulation platform. They're like, "Oh my gosh, this is so good. Oh, this is missing in XYZ of this. And oh, if I could just put this together or do the different things, right?" And we haven't really delved into our synthetic training platform yet. But as we get into that, I think that'll make a little bit make sense, and where we kind of bridge some of those gaps in training and where people are today. And so it'll be interesting to see, um, because as we've gone into the blue list world, being able to these some of these platforms are wildly expensive, and we've seen aversion in operators. And again, Secretary Hedges just put out a memo going, we are going to stop treating these things like, these high value assets. I think in his words, he said they're more like bullets. Well, they're definitely expensive bullets, but if people are unwilling to go out and train on the asset because of the concern of the repercussions of damaging it, which is the same in manned aircraft, right? If you have an accident in a manned aircraft, you will go through an accident investigation board and a safety investigation board to determine the cause. I think there's going to be an interesting piece where we do that. And, when you get to both attritable and expendable sUAS, it becomes an interesting question of, well, if I'm training in real life and I happen to break this thing, how do I manage that, right? So I think there's anecdotal evidence that, providing a synthetic training platform is going to help, and there's massive, statistical evidence on the manned aircraft side that synthetic training works. And in this space, I don't think it's any different. We're going to see that grow out and see the requirement and need for that. In fact, there already is a requirement and need for that. It's happening, and it's happening really quickly.
You mentioned you mentioned sUAS training as it stands today. It was like the IT boom in the 90s, right? Disparate systems. Why do you think, with simulations being as common as it is in crew training, why do you think it hasn't made it yet on the sUAS side?
Well, and I think in a sense, it has, but again,
Mhm.
it's disparate, and
Right.
it's using low cost, off the shelf stuff to get a basic rudimentary flight capability. What we aren't seeing is the mission training, and I just don't think that it's like late 90s, right? Everybody was like, "Hey, let's go buy the things and do the stuff because I want a computer because it makes my life easier." Or hey, I want to use these UAS to do ISR. This would be a huge capability, right? Looking over the next hill if you're a ground force is useful. We've been using balloons since I believe the Civil War to look over the next hill and target artillery and all of the different things. So it's no surprise that we're doing this, but with any nascent technology that wasn't originally designed for combat, the simulators aren't designed for that. And, when the stakes aren't nearly as high, if you're just out flying recreationally or if you're taking pictures for real estate, you crash your drone, you crash your drone. It's an expense to you. But when you're supporting, when you are a supporting force, supporting, to a supported force, you're providing capability. The key is that you need to provide that capability because sometimes it could be life and death. And even if it's not life and death, you are at least putting them in a position where they may not get the support they need, and you have to call an manned asset. And in some cases, in the denied environment, in the EW environments we're working in today, some of the manned assets just can't fly in there.
Mm.
You bring up a very interesting point because you and I were talking about this outside before we started, and that's a topic of major concern in certain theaters, specifically INDOPACOM. And so the reason why I think that's interesting is because the message that was coming out of a panel that was stood up by the Second Triad, it's a new group out of the Army, was that we have to figure out how to communicate in detailed environments with a threat of an ever growing threat on the EW side from the adversary. And so I don't think, at least, the panelists aren't going to give us, their secret sauce in terms of what they're doing. And they're leaving it up to industry to figure it out with them, not for them, with them. And so I guess that teaming effort has always been something that's been interesting to me as a sales guy. But, in your mind, when it comes to sUAS and, obviously operating efficiently and effectively in detailed environments with lives at stake, or at least capability at stake, from a combat perspective, how do you reassure, these, generals, these colonels about, "We have the capability, we're doing it today," or at least we can speak to it and comfort them and support them in their mission? Like, how do you kind of have that conversation with all that's going on right now?
Well, and I think that's a system that's been around the military for years. There's plenty of systems to track readiness, right? And what you're asking, you're saying is, hey, is this force ready to go out and fight the fight? Are they trained and ready? And you look at the org train and equip organizations, which is the Army, Air Force, Navy, Marine Corps, Space Force, and Coast Guard in time of war. Their job is to be able to present ready force to meet the COCOM's needs. And so being able to say, hey, this is what I've done, this is what I've trained, this is how many reps and sets this person has got, they've done this, this was the last time they met all of these, for lack of a better term, in the Air Force, we call it a required performance level or an RPL, key performance indicators, whatever flavor of metric you're calling it. At the end of the day, it's going, this person achieved this training at a satisfactory level and is now current and qualified to go perform this mission. So I don't think you have to reassure them. I think you just have to get the system in place that they're used to seeing that says this force is ready. And right now, it's hard to do that because live training, there's never enough live training. There's never been enough live training, not even in the manned aircraft space. Otherwise, we wouldn't have simulators, right? And so in this case, providing a robust synthetic training platform is necessary and one that is at least common across the force where you can fly multiple different types of UAS using the equipment you fly with, right? You need to fly with your operational controller. You need to fly with your operational drone that performs like your operational drone or UAS and make sure that you're getting that muscle memory. Primacy of learning is a big thing. If you start out playing on an Xbox controller on a game off of Steam, and then you try to switch to your operational controller, you're going to have poor muscle memory and it is going to affect you. So we need to be able to start these UAS operators on the controller they're going to use and keep them on that controller, and then also be able to allow them to use different platforms because we are likely not going to see single qualified people. For the most part, in the DoD manned systems, there are very few multi-qualified crew members, right? They train on a very expensive platform. The training is wildly expensive. It takes forever. And once you're trained on that, we're not just going to switch you over to a different aircraft because it's costly. So in this case, we're talking about drones changing every 6 months or even faster. You're not going to have a 20-year program or a 30-year program of record. You're going to have a program of record for a type or a size of UAS. But as the technology iterates, you're going to have a platform that can ingest this new UAS and train it. And what you don't want to have to do is build a new simulator every time a new platform comes out.
Right.
So, talk to us more about what a robust platform would look like.
So I think for a good synthetic training platform, it has to have a multitude of things. That was gonna be a pretty long list here, but first off, it has to be visually realistic. If you are flying in a cartoon-like atmosphere, again, you can get some training, but what you really want to do is get it down to be as granular as possible, so it looks like what you're doing, where you're training, and that the training environment is realistic. I think the other one, it has to be platform agnostic. It needs to be able to have multiple types of UAS. Going back to what Safe and I were just talking about, is we're going to see rapid UAS changes. I was at AUVSI's Pathfinder Symposium in Huntsville this week, and I looked around the show floor and I was like, I bet in 5 years or even a year, a lot of these platforms are going to look completely different, with the ability to iterate. And we have additive manufacturing. You have companies like Firestorm that are able to put their Excel factory out in the battlefield and produce drones. And as you move into this space where your imagination is the limit, if you don't have a platform that can, you don't have a synthetic training platform that can ingest these different platforms rapidly and allow for training, then you don't have a platform that's useful. I think the other one is controller agnostic. People are going to be using different controllers. There's going to be a push. Maybe one day there will be a one controller to rule them all. But right now that is not the case. Like I said earlier in the talk, is people are running with scissors and they're going to be like, this is really good. Well, and then they're going to go deploy with somebody and they're going to see a unit that has a different controller and they're going to try it out and go, I would really like to switch to that controller. So until those programmers of record and the different services nail down what their platform is, if you can't adapt to that, again, your synthetic training platform becomes useless and will only be providing training from the last platform. So, visually correct, platform agnostic, controller agnostic, and then integratable into the larger simulation atmosphere. So, the DIS allows you to push data between simulators. There's huge programs out there, the DMOC, and the ability to combine all these large aircraft simulators. I think the if you have a UAS simulation platform, it needs to also be able to integrate with that, and then also being able to use the operational tools that you have. For instance, if you are using, ATAC or the Android Tactical Assault Kit is your situational awareness platform on the battlefield. If your simulator can't integrate with ATAC, then you're not going to be training like you fight. And if you're not training like you fight, you're just, producing in the manned aircraft world, it was called a simism, where you're like, oh, that's a simism. Don't pay attention to it. And so you get negative training again. So creating that most operationally correct environment is important. And I think the third one is deployability. We don't need giant server racks and huge simulator bays. Not only are they expensive, you can't take them with you. So if you don't have the capability to be able to train and do these things downrange, you start to lose proficiency and then eventually you lose currency and then eventually you're unqualified. And there will be some level of metric that says that, but the more you practice and the more you have the ability to practice, the better off you're going to be. So um, in today's world, we have the technology to provide an expeditionary type simulator that they can take with them and still be able to train those tasks, do mission rehearsal, exercise, integration, etc.
It's a good question. To kind of build off of that, we mentioned like the benefits of synthetic training, but I would say I like to be skeptical or at least play devil's advocate. But what are the downfalls? Like what are the pitfalls of this type of training?
Well, so no matter how realistic you make it, no matter how amazing the simulator is, you know it's not real, right? You know there's a there the human mind is the human mind. You can't completely trick it into believing, okay, this is real, and if I do this, it's going to mess up. Synthetic training is always going to have some level of simism or synthetic to it, right? Well, if I actually do this and it goes poorly, then nothing bad is going to happen. And that is actually helpful to try things in combat scenarios that you would not try even in our most robust exercises. So, synthetic training allows you to get shot at, right? You can have kinetic weapons flying at your UAS or non-kinetic effects being projected at your UAS inside synthetic that you would not be able to do on a range with a live asset. So, but the shortfall again is it's not real. So there is no substitute for real training, and there's no substitute for going to combat. Uh, Anybody who's been will tell you that you don't really get the sense of it until it's actually occurred. And it's funny, once it's occurred, you're like, okay, I got it. But synthetic training can never give you the full experience of live. So I don't think anybody that advocates a synthetic training can completely eliminate real world training is they're probably not telling you the truth or they don't know what they're talking about.
Is that more tied to um the physical or the physiological response of the human being? Because that leads me to think of like additional capability around VR, or maybe I know AI is a buzzword, but it doesn't really apply here. Maybe in the sense of um, uh, having the operator experience something that's super real world or lifelike. Because for all the gamers out there, you could make the case, right, that when I'm there or playing an FPS or whatever it may be, I feel like I'm right there in the moment and I can simulate real battle. But I'm sure on the scale of the military, there's probably ways that are being replicated today in terms of that emotional response. And I've seen it on the show floors. But is that the trade off? Is that with the synthetic platform you're getting that experience, but emulating that experience, the physiological responses I mentioned, is just a lot more expensive. Is that pretty much the trade off there?
So we have haptic response devices for ARXR. So even in the VR world, they have gloves and socks, and you can put a seat shaker in a chair to give you that haptic response to what it feels like. In the big box sims, they're literally an aircraft cockpit almost exactly. They come up on motion, they shake, they all the different things you hear sounds. Everything is very very lifelike. But it just goes back to what I said in the earlier questions. You just know it's not real, but it helps to have that haptic response. Interestingly enough, I think sUAS training is going to be closer to the real world than anything in the synthetic space because of what we talked about earlier. Is you're not actually in the aircraft. You're not going to feel what is going on in that, which is interesting. And there's a lot of organizations out there. One of them is the 711th Human Performance Wing at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and they do all of the human physiology. And it would be interesting to talk to some of those folks and see if they've started looking at like galvanic skin response and heart rate of people flying a UAS, a small UAS versus a real one versus a synthetic one. And I'm no expert, but
Do you see the industry going there though?
I think the military will
Yeah.
100%. I mean, human performance is a big deal in the military.
Hmm.
I don't think we'll see commercial industry go there. I think
Hmm.
oftentimes they probably lean on what we're doing, but and in the commercial industry, it's a little lower risk depending on what you're doing.
Sure.
If you're inspecting a pipeline or a cracking tower, or if you're using it to inspect pipes, I mean, if you crash your UAS, you crash your UAS, right? But again, when you go back to I'm providing combat capability, whether that's ISR, kinetic effects, non-kinetic effects on the battlefield, and I am supporting forces that are in danger, there's just no way to truly simulate that until it's happening.
Does the COTS MOTS um, factor play in there? Because I know that the military has certain requirements that they want industry to meet from commercial off the shelf software. But inevitably, the military is going to make adjustments and tweak um, as they see fit. So is that kind of like uh, again the reason why I asked the question is industry should probably try to read the mind of the military and vice versa through the military. So that's kind of where I'm going is because I think the point of what you guys have seen in Ukraine is also trying to limit the risk to the fighting force, right? At least that's one aspect. So I would assume that there should be a lot more going into obviously replicating the training environment, and that means money, right? Into building a platform that does that. But um, I feel like budgets and again bureaucracy may get in the way of the and I don't want to get too political here, but the life of the warfighter. Like, can you put a price tag on that? So I think you should spend a lot more money on the training aspect, right? Or budget or whatever you want to call it.
I've lived through multiple different political parties that are in charge of things, and while you see things on the news, I've never truly experienced a huge difference at the warfighter level. I think, rarely are there life, limb, or eyesight decisions made based on politics. Most of the time, if it's necessary to provide the warfighter with what they need, both sides of the aisle seem to be able to move heaven and earth to make it happen. So I tend to ignore the the noise that happens here in the national capital region and pay attention to what's going on. And sure, our niceties go up and down. Like, oh, I have a little bit better of this or a little bit worse of that, sure. But like for actual combat capability, I've never seen the money not appear for the warfighter. I think speaking to trying to read the mind of the the military, I think all corporations should be trying to do that. And you should be like, hey, what's an emerging need? Let me look at what's going on. Now, that's a challenge, especially when you're not privy to the levels of intel that the DoD has. So I think there's some onus on the military to be pretty open about what they need and engage industry. And in the sUAS space, I really do feel like that's happening. I said earlier on that I'm hopeful that it's going to, be able to be creatively creative,
Mm.
and we are seeing that play out. And I think that the running with scissors is going to happen in a good way, and we're going to see that play out. But if you have to, as industry, you have to put some internal research and development or IRAD money into something to provide something to show. And obviously there's other programs out there like SIBRs and a lot of the stuff through the different labs to help smaller companies do that. But I think um, if you're not trying to see the next best thing or you're privy to a really good idea, you need to engage from the corporate side with the DoD and say, hey, what about this thing? And then the DoD needs to come back at you and say, hey, this is a requirement we're seeing emerging. Do you have anything? I think I heard this week that the that there we've got somebody told me, it was off the record, so I'll remain unnamed, but they need to stop writing requirements from the government side in the way that they write them now, because quite often the realm of possible they don't know that whole breadth. And so what they need to do is be more open with the requirement and say, this is the problem I'm trying to solve. Please provide me a solution, and we'll move very quickly if you have a solution that makes sense to do that. And I think we're starting to see that play out, and it will be interesting to see how that process accelerates over the next 3 years.
So you talked a little bit about an ideal synthetic training platform. You talked about merging needs. What would you say are the biggest gaps today in terms of training?
No, that's a great question, and I think there's always gonna be training gaps. We just talked about it, right? There's no substitute for real world training, and there's no substitute for actually going to combat and employing
Right.
your platform. The I think what we see a lot of the gaps in is a lot of the sUAS simulators out there are very good at flight training in what we called clear blue and 22 weather in the Air Force. Is it's perfect, it's beautiful outside, I can fly around, I can do my thing. But what we see is the gaps are manipulating the environment to meet that combat challenge: weather, rain, snow, dust, sea color, sea state, all the different things that affect flight performance and landing, depending on where you're taking off and landing from. And then also the red and blue constructive forces. Oftentimes the sUAS simulators can't simulate that. So you have to be able to engage with those forces like you would be in combat to again do that mission management. So what we really see is, one is that a lot of platforms are single platform, single controller, meaning if you were going to have more than one platform in your arsenal, then you're going to have multiple simulators. That's not only difficult for the operators, it's difficult for the instructor cadre who has to teach them. And it's also difficult to gather the data, right? I talked earlier about required performance levels or RPLs. After every flight, you have to sit down and document what your student met. And if you can automate that, it really helps out the instructor cadre. So again, single platform, single controller simulators, no red and blue constructive forces, no capability to manipulate weather. Some of them do time of day, but aren't able to do different things. We had one DoD organization who was like, "Well, we operate in where it snows. How do you, that's important to have snow accumulation because if you're following somebody's footprints or looking at vehicle tracks, they may disappear depending on how." So we actually coded in a way to do snow accumulation because there's a time limit if you're using the snow as a tracking factor. So I think being able to bring the reality kind of goes back to your, hey, what's a good platform? Getting it as granular as possible and being able to simulate all of that stuff, which happens in the crewed aircraft trainers today. They're very good at simulating a lot of these different things. We aren't seeing those in the single platform uh, systems, synthetic training platforms. So being able to combine all those capabilities, like we have with SynDojo, is it's a game changer, and it gives it gives the operator, it gives the instructor cadre, it gives the services, and ultimately what it does is bring those forces to combat capability faster than our org train and equip commands can then present those forces to the cocoms to go out and move the needle on the battlefield. So closing those gaps has always been our biggest our goal is really like we do everything from the mission focused side going, hey, if I was training or if I was this, I need my simulator to do that. And we get a lot of great feedback. We do demos all the time. We bring it out, we let the operators put their hands on the sticks, fly the simulator, and they're like, oh, can you do this? And we're really agile in the sense that oftentimes, can it do this? And we can look at our dev team and overnight, we can do an overnight build, and that overnight build will come out with a new capability the next day and be able to do what they need. Now, it isn't always that fast, but I think that's another piece of a good simulation platform is I don't want a 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, 5 year update cycle with the way tactics, techniques, and procedures are training in the small UAS world or changing in the small UAS world and the way the platforms are changing. If you can't have agile development in your platform, you're going to become irrelevant very, very quickly.
Yeah, I think actually, sorry, hold on to your thought if you don't mind. Um, Again, going back to my conversation that I had or the panel that I sat on with the Navy was just that. Is they were saying that very quickly, you guys have to be able to adjust your requirements on the fly from the industry side. If you're not doing that, don't come and talk to us, right? Um, I did have another point to mention was that maybe along the same vein was that with how the government has been affected in terms of rifts. Are you seeing more folks on the sUAS side, on the military side, seeing the value now that you said time to like training an operator is a lot more efficient with Syndojo. Are you seeing that like bear fruit, or at least seeing folks more open to having the conversation and seeing the value?
I would say the answer to your question in the last is literally shifted gears in the last month of we need a simulation platform. We need to do this quickly and it needs to be good. And it needs to provide that capability in a manner that is flexible or don't come talk to us. Right. And so there is a large amount of momentum about this, right? Because what you talk about is they're going to go out and buy these UAS platforms, the DoD organizations, and they're going to get X number of platform. Well, they can't afford to crash those, and quite often sUAS, especially Group 1 through 3, tend to get crashed a lot more often than manned systems or the larger UAS. So, in when we're talking about ISR, it's like a typical flying squadron. You have so many UAS to do your whatever it is, and whether that's the soldier-borne sensor, which is something that every soldier can carry and fly, or whether that is, a larger Group 3 that's a high-value asset that has got a expensive sensor on it, et cetera. Um, you can't just take those out and lose them. Otherwise, you lose your combat capability, right? And so that is where the synthetic training comes in because it allows you to preserve that fleet. Now, when you talk about the one-way attack mission or kinetic mission, those are magazines, right? And we have to protect our magazine depth. You cannot be going and training a one-way attack mission using real UAS over and over and over again because you will use, as Secretary Head says, these are bullets. Well, there are some flavor of kinetic round. You can't use up all your rounds in training, or you will have no rounds to go to war with. And even down to the small arms space, there's war readiness rounds and there are training rounds, all the way down to 9 millimeter bullets in the military. We're going to have to look at UAS in the same sense. So not only do we preserve the fleet that's doing ISR or other specialized missions, but by doing synthetic training, we can allow for kinetic training or the one-way attack mission to be trained mostly synthetically, and then you will go out and get whatever prescribed number of live rounds are to get qualified.
which helps in those missions being a lot more effective.
Sure, and preserving magazine depth
Right.
and the fleet.
Right.
So let's take a step back here. For someone listening with a fresh set of ears, why is it important to have a multi-platform system? Why is it important to not have a multitude of simulators? Can you tell us more about that?
Well, hey, yeah, absolutely. So I think the first one is having a multitude of simulators makes it difficult for everybody. It goes back to the initial conversation. You don't want to go from Cannon Air Force Base to Hurlburt Field, Florida, and have to deal with a different system. You should go, if you were flying a UAS simulator at Cannon, then you should be able to fly the same UAS simulator at Hurlburt and vice versa. Obviously, just picking bases that I'm familiar with, but it doesn't matter. It depends on whatever you're doing. You should be able to use the same training device where you're going. You shouldn't have to relearn that. I think the second piece is, I mentioned it before, is the instructor cadre's workload. If I'm an instructor and I have 5 different UAS platforms that I have to train and there are 5 different simulators, that is a pain,
Yeah.
because they all work differently. They probably all have different UIs or user interfaces, and if those that makes it difficult not only for the instructor but the student. I think the other piece is the ability to build out scenarios. If the scenario build, if it's existent, right? We talked about red and blue constructive forces. Um, if you don't have the capability to build out these scenarios rapidly and easily, then it's just a non-starter. And then if you're like, oh well, we're going to train the one-way attack mission, but this simulator doesn't really do it, so we'll get the basic flight on this simulator, but then we're going to pop over to this other simulator that may not actually give us the basic flight parameters as good as this one, but it's going to give you the one-way attack procedures. What you're seeing there is the inability to combine what we talked about very early on is the flight and the mission management. If you can't push those two things together, then you're not really doing very good training. And then so that having a single platform, one system to train them all makes it better for the operator. They're familiar with it. They can use their operational controller. They can select which platform they're flying because I think there will be multi-qualified UAS operators, unlike manned aircraft for the most part. And it also allows you to track all the data, who's flying, how much they've flown, have they hit these certain specific goals. Inside Syndojo, there's a capability to basically put a bubble that you can't see in, but saying you will put your UAS in this space, or you have flown your UAS to this target and you have successfully hit the target. All of that data can be captured and then it can be put out in a file and then subsequently sent into a learning management system, which eases the workload on the instructor. It eases the workload on the operator, knowing, oh, I don't have to sit down and write all these different things. So having that robust kind of one platform gives you a lot of capability that doesn't exist if you're trying to use multi platform simulators. So and then again, just the ability to be agile. If I have a simulator for a single platform and then a new platform comes out that is not the same company, or even the aero model may not exist as we rapidly iterate these UAS, then now that simulator has become obsolete and now I have to learn something new, or I may not even have the capability to begin with. So now we're back training on real assets again, which negates the whole, preserve the fleet or manage the magazine depth.
So this has been a great discussion so far. So, in terms of summarizing the benefits of incorporating connected UAS train or synthetic training for UAS, would you say that it would be efficiency in terms of the operator and the instructor, dynamic training, and the ability to minimize risk? And on top of that question, would there be anything else that you would add in terms of summarizing the benefits.
Yeah, so I've tried to steer clear of just talking about our platform and coming from a general topic, but I think it's all of those things you just said. And we've known this. This is no secret. It's been
Mhm.
this way in the man training platform forever. We have platforms where the first time a pilot touches a set of controls, they are in an aircraft by themselves. Quite frankly, two of our most expensive platforms in the Air Force are trained just like that because they don't have what we call the family model, right? There's no two-seater F-22s or
Right.
F-35s out there. So I think we've always known there's a return on investment, ROI. There's cost savings by doing synthetic training. I flew on the CV-22. I knew exactly how much the simulator hours cost on that, and I knew exactly how much it cost to fly the real aircraft. It was a hugely different number, right? The
Mm.
simulator was way less expensive. Um, so getting the blocking and tackling done, the mission management tasks, all these things are going to provide value. Not only because if I'm just dealing specifically with a training fleet, if I can get these low hanging fruit tasks done in the synthetic world, and then I can have these other assets doing the live training, you can create a more robust student pipeline. So I can go, okay, this group of 8 humans is doing synthetic, this group of 8 humans is doing real world. And now I'm training 16 students at once instead of 8 students at once. And it gives you the ability to increase throughput through that pipeline. And that's really what it comes down to. We call it program flight training in the Air Force, but you have a certain number of students you're responsible for making. And if you can increase that pipeline, you can then create more operators more quickly, creating more combat capability. And so I think it does that. It absolutely is going to create the ability, Syndojo specifically, because we do meet all of these things, the capability to have multi-platform. We're controller agnostic. We have the ability to do red and blue constructive forces. We can integrate with this. We're integrated with ATAC and the TAC ecosystem. All the different things that an operator would need to go take a UAS to combat exist inside the synthetic world. And that gives you the ability to go out and do all the things. And so once you have that capability and it's proliferated across the different organizations, then we are really looking at increasing our national security. And, then obviously our coalition partners and all of the different places that need this capability. Then we get away from what we started about in the late 90s with IT, and we get away from what we're doing now is all these varied things. And as you consolidate that, you increase the efficiency of the instructor cadre, you increase the rapidity of getting an operator from brand new person who's never flown a UAS to somebody who's current and qualified to go out and do a combat mission. And then you have the ability to be agile inside that system because it's not married to a certain platform. It gives you the ability to add the new capabilities that are being demanded by our leadership or the DoD leadership in today's world. So, um, there's always differing opinions. Of course, we welcome those. I'm assuming there will be people that make comments on that, and we'll definitely monitor those and be interested in having those discussions. But as we move out into this brave new world of small UAS and fiber drones and all the different things, and we're seeing tactics, techniques, and procedures change on the battlefield more rapidly than we ever have before. Um, Being able to roll with punches on our side and get inside the decision cycle of the enemy on their TTPs is huge. And so having that rapid, agile, capable platform, right? There's probably things that are rapid and agile. Oftentimes they may not be capable. You have to put all three of those things together. Once you have all three of those things together, you just generate combat power and combat advantage more quickly. And in the commercial world, it provides you ROI faster by being able to push your operators from new to confident and capable more quickly. It will wreck fewer UAS, and you also have a capability to provide a paper trail on this training. So if anything does go wrong, God forbid, you'd be like, this person did all of their training. This is how many hours they flew. This is how many hours they flew synthetically. This is how many hours they flew in the real world. They met all these performance levels. Here you go. And I think I would be remiss if I didn't close out with the worst thing we can do is lay the manned training framework over sUAS. There's great things from the manned um, aircraft training side that should be brought over, but it doesn't mean all of it should be brought over um, because it is arguably pretty onerous to do that. There is an entire career field aviation resource management inside the United States Air Force who is completely dedicated to managing aircrew training. It is like a whole other job. And what we don't want to do, and Saif said it several times of bureaucracy and politics, is turn sUAS training and capability with these systems that can be rapidly evolved and used in new ways into what is arguably the legacy system with all of these different requirements that are handed down. There's got to be requirements. You have to have rights and lefts. But I think in the sUAS world, those rights and lefts can be a lot wider, and you have to make it so at least we don't start out in the space with lots of bureaucracy and politics. And I think going back to the IT world in 1997, I don't think there was such a thing as an ATO or RMF, right? Authority Operator Risk Management Framework. That only came later. Not to say that those things aren't necessary as we go, but in the same breath, we don't want to start out with a hugely bureaucratic uh, framework that came from the manned aircraft world, which has some significantly different safety requirements than with these sUAS, because if we do, it will get to the point where it's limiting. And so synthetic training should be in the same boat. We should rapidly move down that direction, enable the operator to get new capability, roll it out very quickly, and be able to do that inside that platform. And draw the hard line. Well, I wouldn't call it hard. Draw the soft line between manned and unmanned training, and take what's good, and then develop what needs to be done for sUAS.
Well, that's been really insightful, Kevin. So the message is clear, right? It is important to have live training. Nothing can replace that. But by the same token, in this day and age, we are able to supplement a lot of things with synthetic training, and now blending the two together is the key to fighting the missions of tomorrow.